Tonight, I want you to listen, really listen, to the silence between my words. Imagine a world where that silence is all you'd ever hear from a loved one's lips, where voices are locked behind closed doors, just out of reach. Now, lean closer. Picture a young man hunched over wires and batteries, scraps of copper and tiny reeds, his mind burning with one question. What if we could send a voice through a wire? His name was Alexander Graham Bell, teacher of the deaf, restless tinkerer, accidental tycoon, and the man whose invention turned distance into nothing but a whisper. Some remember him as the father of the telephone. Some forget the teacher who gave the silent a chance to speak. But tonight, we tune in to the static and the spark to find the boy, the dreamer, and the voice that changed the world. This is Faces of History. I'm the Duke of New York. And tonight, we pick up the line for Alexander Graham Bell. Before the wires, before the voice that leapt across oceans, before the name Alexander Graham Bell rang through courtroom walls and patent wars, there was just a boy in Edinburgh, a boy named Alec. Alec Bell was born on March 3rd, 1847, in a stone house at 16 South Charlotte Street, the middle son of a family obsessed with one thing: speech. Not just the noise that spills from our lips when we're careless, but the precision of it, the art of making thought travel on breath. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, was no ordinary teacher. He was an elocutionist, a master of the spoken word, the inventor of visible speech, a strange alphabet of hooks, curves, and lines that showed the tongue where to press, the throat how to hum, the lips how to shape a sound you'd never heard. And his grandfather? A teacher too. So gifted at coaching actors and orators that the Scottish courts once called him in to help people speak well enough to be understood by a jury. In the Bell House, sound was currency, a thing to study, dissect, shape, and command. But for Alec, the boy, it was also fragile, because silence lived in their home too. His mother, Eliza Grace Simons Bell, was going deaf. By the time Alec was old enough to form words, he knew that sound could slip away like smoke from a chimney. He watched her cup her ear when his father spoke, watched her strain to catch a piano note drifting through thick curtains. He refused to let her drift into silence alone. So Alec, small and curious, learned to tap messages on her hand, to write big, bold words on scraps of paper, to play the piano so she could feel the vibration through the floorboards beneath her feet. When he spoke to her, he didn't just talk. He shouted with his eyes, his hands, his touch. He learned that communication wasn't just air buzzing through vocal cords. It was the shared electricity between two people who refused to let silence win. Alec wasn't alone in his wild curiosity. He had two brothers, Melly and Edward, both bright, both driven by the same family gift for words and ideas. When other boys built wooden swords, the Bell brothers built machines. Alec's first invention came at age 12, a simple dehusking device for their neighbor's flour mill. Gears and paddles crafted from bits of brush and metal scraps. It worked so well that the mill owner gave him his first wage, a young inventor's pay in copper coins. He'd carry that memory all his life. The rush of seeing an idea leave your brain, slip into your hands, and take shape in the world. But the shadows of loss stalked the Bell House. Consumption, tuberculosis, crept into the lungs of Alec's brothers. First Melly, then Edward. Brilliant, strong, alive one season, coughing blood the next. One by one, they vanished into that same silence that terrified their mother. Alec, the middle son, became the only son. He watched death steal voices, not just words, but the people who made them. And in that loss, something hard and bright ignited inside him. The sense that maybe, just maybe, he could build a bridge across that abyss. He read everything he could find about anatomy, acoustics, resonance, the music of speech. He begged scraps of time from his father's lessons, studying how the shape of a mouth made an A or a Z dance in the air. He watched students at his father's lectures struggle with crooked vowels and strangled consonants, and he dreamed of freeing them. Alec Bell was just a boy, but in that Edinburgh attic, among dusty books and brass scraps, he listened harder than anyone else. He listened to the gaps in sound, the places where silence crept in and swallowed connection, and in those quiet places, he planted a single impossible question. What if no voice was ever lost? A question that would follow him across an ocean, that would haunt him through failures, fortunes, and bitter courtrooms. a question that would become wires, coils, and copper reeds, and a name that rang from one end of the world to the other. The boy who listened to silence would grow up to make the whole world speak. Imagine standing on the deck of a creaking steamship in 1870. The North Atlantic stretches out like an iron gray mirror, endless and unforgiving. Salt spray stings your face, the wind tugs at your coat, and in your pocket, folded tight, is a letter from a doctor that says, "Leave Scotland, or bury what's left of your family in its damp, cold ground." That was Alexander Graham Bell's last look at Edinburgh, a city of soft mists and hard funerals. Tuberculosis had already stolen his brothers. Now it reached for him too, his lungs tight with every cough, his mother's eyes shadowed with worry. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, the stern master of visible speech, made the only choice he could: pack up what they had left of life and sail for the New World. They chose Canada, a wild, wide promise of cleaner air and second chances. When the Bell family stepped onto Canadian soil, they didn't find palaces or paved streets. They found Brantford, Ontario, a small settlement wrapped in pine trees and damp fields. For a family used to stone townhouses and bustling lecture halls, it might as well have been the edge of the earth. But for Alec, now 23, thin, pale, hungry for air, Canada felt like hope. He walked for miles through the forests, notebooks stuffed in his pockets. He studied the songs of birds, the hum of insects, the way sound carried through trees and across frozen rivers. Here, under wide skies, he could breathe again. He taught his mother to feel the world in new ways, reading lips, sensing footsteps in the vibrations of the floorboards. They sat together at the piano in the parlor, Alec playing so she could press her fingertips to the wooden lid and feel the melody dancing under her skin. It wasn't enough to save her hearing, but it saved something else: the bridge between mother and son, sound and silence. Still, young Alec couldn't settle for long. His father soon found work lecturing on elocution, teaching Canadians and Americans alike how to mold words into clear, whisper speech. But Alec wanted something different. In Brantford, he first toyed with the idea of harmonic telegraphy, a strange technical name for an impossible dream, sending multiple messages down a single wire using different sound frequencies. While others saw telegraphs tapping out dots and dashes, Alec saw something else: voices floating down copper lines. He built crude devices in the barn. He strung wires across the fields. Local farmers saw him wandering with scraps of metal and old tuning forks, talking to himself about vibrations and membranes. They called him odd, a dreamer, a gentle madman. But Alec just smiled, because in the rustle of wind through the pines, he heard the echo of an idea that would not die. By 1871, word of his gift had spread. Boston needed a teacher for the deaf, a man who could do what his father did, maybe more. And Boston was no sleepy village. It was a crucible of invention: wires, gears, Morse code, and steam engines all humming under a young America's skin. So Alec packed up his meager notes, a few clothes, his father's pride, and his mother's memory, and boarded a train for the United States. He arrived with ideas so big they barely fit in his valise. In Boston, he found students hungry to speak, parents desperate to hear their children's voices. And in that old, buzzing city beside the Atlantic he just crossed, he found the spark that would pull all his wild thoughts into a single copper wire. The scratch of chalk on slate, the gentle murmur of a student repeating sounds, the warm hush of a classroom late at night. He rented a tiny room on a thin income. By day, he taught at the Boston School for the Deaf. By night, he sprawled over makeshift workbenches, scraps of metal, acid-scarred wires, borrowed batteries humming weakly in the dark. His students called him Professor Bell. His neighbors called him that odd fellow with wires all over the floor. But if you'd stood at his door and knocked, you'd find a young man hunched over a piece of paper that read, "What if a voice could ride a current?" The sea had carried Alexander Graham Bell away from grief, away from the ghost of his brothers. But it carried him to something else: a new world humming with electricity, and an audience that just might listen when he spoke. Next, that gentle teacher would find a machinist named Watson, and together they'd wire the whole world for sound. When Alexander Graham Bell stepped off the train in Boston, he wasn't yet the man who made the world speak. He was just Professor Bell, a lanky young Scot with a gentle voice, an unruly mop of hair, and a head full of half-wired dreams. He arrived with no fortune, no patents, no fame, just the quiet force of a teacher who believed that sound was more than noise. It was a bridge for the forgotten. Boston in the 1870s was booming. The Civil War had ended only a few years earlier, and America was laying new telegraph lines, spinning new wheels of industry. The city was alive with invention, and Bell found himself at the center of it all. He took a position at the Boston School for the Deaf, one of the few places where hearing the unheard was a mission, not a miracle. Bell's classroom was no ordinary schoolroom. Instead of rows of silent children staring at blackboards, he taught his students to feel sound, placing their fingers on his throat, their hands on their own lips, watching how vibrations shaped a word. He worked with the children of families who could afford his private lessons, Boston's wealthy merchants and politicians, desperate for their silent sons and daughters to find a voice. Among them was one student who changed everything, Mabel Hubbard. A brilliant, curious young woman, struck deaf by scarlet fever as a child, Mabel was no passive pupil. She pushed back, asked questions, forced Bell to sharpen his methods, to find new ways to make the invisible visible. Her father, Gardner Hubbard, a Boston lawyer and powerful man in city politics, quickly noticed something about the young Scotsman tutoring his daughter. Not just his talent with the deaf, but his relentless tinkering after class. Bell talked about harmonic telegraphs. He talked about sending multiple telegraph messages at once. He talked about voices traveling on wires. And to Gardner Hubbard, who had lost a fortune fighting Western Union's monopoly on the telegraph, Bell's wild idea sounded like revenge and profit. So by day, Alexander Graham Bell was Professor Bell, patient, gentle, coaxing vowels and consonants from students who had never heard their own names. By night, he was the dreamer, hunched over workbenches, cluttered with scrap copper, acid-scarred batteries, and sketches no one else could read. It was in those Boston nights that Bell met Thomas Watson, a young, clever machinist with grease under his nails and an ear for fine metalwork. Watson could take Bell's sketches, those half-mad scribbles of magnets and diaphragms, and make them real. In a cramped attic workshop at 109 Court Street, teacher and the machinist began building a machine that didn't exist yet. They called it their harmonic telegraph, but what they were really building was something no one dared name, a telephone. They wrapped coils, wound wires, fused batteries. They struck tuning forks and watched how sound waves carved invisible paths through thin air. They borrowed money from skeptical backers, Hubbard among them, and spent it on endless copper and batteries that hissed and sparked. Sometimes they made progress. Sometimes they made nothing but smoke. And still, every morning, Bell rose before dawn, washed the chemical burns from his fingers, and returned to his students. He gave lessons in drawing breath over stubborn consonants. He trained children to feel syllables buzzing through the bones of the jaw and chest. He refused to let the classroom become a casualty of the workshop, because for Alexander Graham Bell, these two worlds, the silent children and the crackling wires, were one. If he could make a voice leap across a wire, he could make the whole world a classroom. If he could make metal speak, he could make silence yield. A faint echo, as if a voice once trapped flickers through a coil of wire. This was Boston's hidden paradox. In the heart of a city spinning iron and steam into industry, Bell's greatest invention was not a machine, but a promise that one day, distance would fall silent and silence would find its voice. The teacher of the deaf was about to teach the whole world how to listen. Next, the young professor would trade chalk and slate for copper and coil, and speak the first words that would echo down every line we lift today. Picture a cramped attic workshop above a Boston boarding house in the winter of 1876. The wallpaper peels from damp walls. The air smells of ozone and hot copper. Two men stand shoulder to shoulder in the flickering light of oil lamps, one with a professor's gentle hands, the other with a machinist's grease-blackened fingers. Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Watson, the teacher and the tinkerer, both half-starved, half-crazy with fatigue, surrounded by bits of wire, magnets, membranes stretched tight as drumheads, and glass jars bubbling with acid. They had one goal: to send a voice through a wire. Bell's idea was simple and impossible. The telegraph could send signals, dots and dashes tapped out by skilled hands. But what if you didn't have to translate sound into code? What if you could send the sound itself, the shape of a voice, the living breath of words? To Bell, it was all about vibration. The human ear is a membrane, a drum that dances when air moves. If you could build an artificial ear, a diaphragm that caught the voice's vibrations and turned them into an electric current that raced down a wire, well, maybe, just maybe, you could make that current drum on a second diaphragm far away, pushing the air again, a voice reborn. It sounded like madness. Many thought it was. Western Union dismissed him outright. Bell's own father gently urged him to stick with teaching. Investors wondered if they were throwing money down a bottomless pit of sparks and copper coils. But Bell couldn't stop. Neither could Watson. Night after night, they built crude prototypes. One day, a thin sheet of gold beater's skin stretched over a mouthpiece. The next, a cluster of tuning forks humming together in strange harmony. Sometimes they burned their hands with acid. Sometimes the batteries hissed and died. Sometimes the attic filled with the smell of charred copper and failure. And sometimes, just sometimes, they heard something. A faint buzz. A tiny hum that told them they were close. Then, one rainy March evening, the breakthrough. The device that day was crude, a simple transmitter with a diaphragm, a thin sheet of parchment stretched over a small magnet and coil. When you spoke into it, the vibrations of your voice moved the diaphragm, which moved the coil inside a magnetic field, generating an electric current that mimicked the voice's wave. On the other end, a receiver would reverse the process. The electric current would push a second diaphragm, recreating the sound. Simple, in theory. But no one had made it work. Bell and Watson had been adjusting wires, tightening screws, tweaking the acid battery when it happened. Bell, frustrated, leaned over the transmitter to call out to Watson in the next room. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." Simple words, unremarkable words. But Watson, standing in the adjoining room, ear pressed to the receiver, heard not a buzz, not a hiss, not a code tapped out in dots and dashes. He heard Bell's voice, a living sound vibrating across copper wire, the first human words ever carried by electricity. Watson dropped his tools, stumbled into the other room, wide-eyed, half laughing. "I heard every word," he told Bell. And just like that, the voice of one man had crossed the void, from mouth to wire to ear. Distance, for the first time, had been silenced by a whisper. They did it again and again, tweaking wires, adjusting magnets. Sometimes the words blurred into static. Sometimes they rang clear as a bell, no pun intended. By morning, the world had changed, though the world didn't know it yet. Bell rushed to file his patent, just hours before rivals like Elisha Gray tried to stake the same claim. Lawyers sharpened their knives. Western Union scoffed, then panicked. Investors squabbled over a technology they barely understood. But none of that mattered to Bell that night. What mattered was that the silence he'd grown up fearing, the silence that stole his mother's hearing, that locked the deaf away in quiet isolation, had been cracked open. A human voice had crossed a wire, and the teacher who taught the silent to speak had just taught the entire world how to listen. Picture this. It's the late 1870s, and the young teacher from Boston, the quiet professor who once leaned over wires and whispered, "Mr. Watson, come here," is now standing under the cold chandeliers of a courtroom facing a wall of lawyers in silk waistcoats. Alexander Graham Bell didn't just invent a machine. He sparked a gold rush. And like every gold rush, it drew out the dreamers, the speculators, and the wolves. Soundscape, the scratching of a quill on legal briefs, the murmur of men in stiff collars arguing in corridors thick with cigar smoke. The moment Bell's patent hit the registry, patent number 174,465, the vultures began to circle. You see, Bell wasn't the only mind chasing voices down copper lines. Other inventors, like Elisha Gray, had nearly beaten him to the finish line. Gray filed his caveat, a legal note of intention, just hours after Bell's lawyer filed the patent. Some whispered Gray's design was closer to practical. Some claimed Bell's lawyer had slipped in line first with a suspicious sense of timing. It didn't matter what was fair. It mattered who held the paperwork. Bell's greatest invention was now chained to a single sheet of paper, a patent that gave him the sole right to build and sell a telephone. But the telegraph giants, Western Union chief among them, didn't think much of this skinny professor's claim. They laughed. The telegraph was a proven empire, wires stretching coast to coast, messages tapped out in Morse code by the thousands each hour. Why would they trade that cash cow for a crackling, unpredictable gadget that only carried one voice at a time? So they passed on Bell's offer to sell them the patent for $100,000, a fortune for the young teacher, a rounding error for Western Union. They shrugged him off until they heard what the little box could really do. When demonstrations began, when Bell and Watson showed audiences that a voice could fly over miles of wire, clear as a church bell, public wonder turned to investor panic. Western Union realized too late they'd laughed at the future, and now the future threatened their iron grip. The lawsuits came like a thunderstorm. Alicia Gray claimed Bell had stolen his idea. Other inventors said they'd beaten him to the principle. They just failed to make it sing. Western Union, suddenly awake to the threat, tried to muscle in from the side, snapping up rival patents, bankrolling alternative designs, setting up copycat telephone companies to swamp Bell's fragile new business. And so the fight for the line began. The slow drone of testimony. The calm, clear voice of Bell reciting how he'd dreamed the idea long before the rival filings. For years, Bell spent almost as much time in courtrooms as he did in workshops. He faced down cross-examinations designed to break him. Lawyers peppering him with questions about every drawing, every conversation, every slip of the tongue that might hint he'd borrowed more than he'd built. They pried into his private notes, dragged in witnesses, forced Watson to recount the attic nights in exhausting detail. They tried to prove the teacher was nothing but a clever thief. But Bell held. His notes were thorough. His diary full of sketches no one else had seen. His testimony unwavering. And the truth, or at least the truth that mattered to the judges, was that his machine had worked first. Patent by patent, claim by claim, the challenges fell away. One by one, judges ruled that the line belonged to Bell, not Gray, not Western Union's pet inventors, not the tangled army of would-be rivals trying to catch a spark of his thunder. By the early 1880s, the Bell Telephone Company had survived. It had crushed or absorbed the competition. Western Union, the great giant, blinked and struck a settlement that handed the telephone to Bell's company outright in exchange for a share of profits. In a few short years, Bell's voice machine was no longer just a curiosity. It was an empire under construction. Copper wires strung between houses, offices, cities. Switchboards buzzing day and night with operators shouting, "Number, please." In 1877, there were just a handful of telephones in use. By the mid-1880s, there were tens of thousands, and they belonged, legally, entirely to Bell. For the boy who'd once watched his mother slip into silence, the irony was sharp. He'd given the world its loudest invention, but he now spent more time defending it in court than perfecting it in the lab. He never wanted to be a ruthless tycoon. He was a teacher first, an inventor second, and a businessman only by necessity. But necessity made him rich. Wealth poured in faster than he could spend it. And with every copper wire laid across rooftops and streets, his dream marched further away from Boston's attic and into the lives of millions. The fight for the line was dirty. It was long. It was brutal. But Bell's voice, the one that first whispered through the wire to Watson, won. The teacher of the deaf had forced the world to listen, whether it liked it or not. Next, Alexander Graham Bell would face an even greater question: what to do with a fortune made from other people's voices? Would he hoard it? Or would he, like Carnegie, like others before him, turn his wealth into another invention altogether? Picture the great man in his later years, but don't picture him in a boardroom, counting profits by the flicker of gaslight. Picture him instead on the shores of Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, wind in his wild hair, sleeves rolled to the elbow, trousers muddied at the hems. Picture him bent over a new sketch, half his mind drifting far from the copper lines that made him famous. Because Alexander Graham Bell never wanted to be just the telephone man. To him, the telephone was one idea in a galaxy of ideas, and he'd be damned if he spent his life polishing one shining trophy while the rest of the frontier went unexplored. Bell built his refuge at Bean Bray, Beautiful Mountain in Gaelic, an estate perched above the glistening Brasdor Lake. Here, far from the lawsuits and stock tickers, he returned to what he loved best: questions. At Bainbray, he turned barns and boathouses into laboratories. He filled them with wires and engines, kites and propellers, sheep and water tanks. Visitors arriving at the docks might spot the old inventor steering a hydrofoil across the lake at record speeds or launching monstrous kites into a screaming Cape Breton wind. One day he'd be testing how to transmit sound with beams of light. The photophone, a distant ancestor to the fiber optics that carry your voice today. The next, he'd be sketching giant tetrahedral kites to lift men into the sky. If the world thought he'd retire to count dividends, it hadn't met Alexander Graham Bell. He even turned his restless curiosity to biology. In the rolling pastures of Bainbray, Bell bred sheep, not for profit, but for perfection. He wanted to understand genetics. He sketched out theories about how traits pass through generations. He fussed over the curl of a fleece the way he once fussed over the tension of a diaphragm membrane. Some days neighbors whispered about the strange old man playing Noah with his sheep and kites. But Bell didn't care. He'd spent half a lifetime listening to people tell him what couldn't be done, and he knew better than to listen now. But even as he chased new wonders, Bell never lost sight of his first calling, the teacher. He spent fortunes funding schools for the deaf, researching better methods of education, fighting, sometimes controversially, for speech over sign language, convinced his methods could lift the silence from millions of children. He sat on committees. He gave lectures. He opened his home to students, young inventors, journalists, anyone who wanted to glimpse the mind that wired the world. In his final decades, he watched new technologies, radio, early sound recording, sprout from the same seed he had planted with that first copper wire. He refused to patent some ideas, the photophone, for instance, because he believed knowledge should belong to the public if it could make the world better. The soft hush of waves against a dock, the distant creak of an old man's footsteps. In the end, the world's greatest talker drifted back into silence. His beloved Mabel, the girl he'd once taught to feel vibrations on a piano lid, stood at his side, her hearing lost completely now, but her mind sharp as ever. Bell by then was an old man in a white beard and walking stick, more wizard than tycoon. His final days were quiet, his mind still alive with questions, but his body giving way to the same relentless fate that once drove his family from Scotland's damp chill. On August 2nd, 1922, at Bainbray, Alexander Graham Bell took his last breath. When news of his passing crackled down the very lines he'd once strung through Boston attics, an entire continent fell quiet for him. In tribute, every telephone in North America, every humming wire, every copper lifeline fell silent for 1 full minute. The man who gave the world its electric voice was gone. But here's the truth. The line never died with him. It runs under oceans now. It hums in fiber optic cables buried in the deepest trenches of the sea. It pulses in satellites orbiting far above his beloved Bainbray. It lives in every whispered hello, every confession down a wire, every late-night call across continents. The faint ring of a modern cell phone, a single word, hello. Because for all the other wonders he chased, the kites, the hydrofoils, the photophone flickers in the dark, Alexander Graham Bell's greatest gift was not the wire, but the bridge, the stubborn belief that distance is no excuse not to listen. Next time you press a phone to your ear, hear more than static. Hear the boy at his mother's piano. Hear the teacher coaxing a sound from silent lips. Hear the spark that leapt across a copper coil and carried the first human voice where silence once ruled. Next time you speak across miles, remember the mind that refused to stop at one invention, the restless teacher, the wanderer, the dreamer who chased sound beyond the wire. Alexander Graham Bell, standing on the porch of his beloved home above Brasdor Lake, cane in hand, white beard dancing in the Atlantic breeze. The blast furnaces of Pittsburgh, the marble corridors of patent offices, the smoke-filled courtrooms of the Bell monopoly, all far behind him now. Before him, water, sky, and wind. The same elements he'd chased in his kites and hydrofoils. The same wild hush that once filled his childhood home when his mother cupped her ear and leaned close to catch the faintest word. By the time old age found him, Bell was no longer the lean young professor peering through wires in a Boston attic. He was the world's beloved father of the telephone, a title he carried uneasily. He'd never truly cared about the telephone as a business. For Bell, the wonder had always been the principle, the puzzle of sound itself, the mystery of how air and vibration could leap space and time. In his final years, Bell drifted back to the questions that first fired his mind. But now there was less metal and more spirit. He dreamed of transmitting light, of freeing speech from the cables altogether. His photophone, an invention so ahead of its time it would take a century for fiber optics to prove him right, never made him a dime, but he called it his greatest work. His workshop still rattled with mad experiments. He built new hydrofoils that skated like skipping stones across Brasdor Lake, chasing speed records, chasing the horizon. He tinkered with aviation, watched young men lift off from the sands of Kitty Hawk and whispered, yes, that was the future too. But in the quiet, Bell's mind always circled back to voices and to silence. He worried that the telephone, his miracle, had become just another tool for profit, strung up by cold wires of commerce. He wondered if it would still serve the people who needed it most, the deaf, the isolated, the forgotten. He funded schools, training centers, foundations for the hard of hearing. He gave freely to research. He debated, sometimes fiercely, with other educators about how deaf children should learn, whether to speak, to sign, or both. It was the one fight he never fully won, and the one that lingered in his heart longer than any lawsuit. On a warm summer day in 1922, the old teacher finally lay down. Pneumonia had come for him like the damp Scottish winters that took his brothers. Mabel sat at his bedside. The student who became his wife, the bright girl whose silent world had opened when he taught her to feel the piano's hum. At the end, his last word was simple. A soft nod to the woman who had shaped so many of his restless days. No. A whisper, faint as static on a dying line, but clear enough for Mabel to understand. He did not wish for morphine. He would take the final call awake. And when the news crossed the wires he had strung, wires carrying voices that never needed to shout across oceans again, a hush spread across a continent. For 1 full minute, every telephone in the United States and Canada fell silent. Switchboards quiet. Operators stood, heads bowed. A nation that had learned to speak at the push of a button laid its voice down in tribute to the man who made it possible. In that silence, the child who listened to the hush of his mother's piano, the teacher who drew sounds from the lips of the deaf, the restless inventor who taught copper to sing, all of them were there. His line never truly closed. Today, it hums beneath city streets and under oceans, bounces from satellites, spins through fiber optics finer than a hair. Every time we whisper across continents, every time we say hello to someone we can't touch but still hold close, we stand on the wire bell strung in a Boston attic. The wire that taught the world distance is no reason for silence. So next time you hold a phone to your ear, pause. Listen to the static behind the words. In that hum, you'll find a boy at his mother's side, a teacher in a Boston schoolroom, a dreamer hunched over a table of copper and magnets. You'll hear Alexander Graham Bell, not the tycoon, not the courtroom warrior, but the restless soul who believed sound could travel anywhere if only you gave it a chance. That was his final call. Not a word, but a whisper that never ends. And if you learned something tonight, share this story, subscribe, leave a review, and tell your friends that Faces of History doesn't just teach. It lifts a receiver, dials the impossible, and keeps the line open for the next dreamer. I'm the Duke of New York. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, some voices never hang up.